So Nietzsche and St. Thomas, Thomism after MacIntyre. I thought I would follow the following trajectory. Sorry for the date that is wrong there. So we're going to begin with what MacIntyre describes in After Virtue as a disquieting suggestion. Then look at his notion of Nietzsche as a kind of new Kamehameha II. Then see how Elizabeth Anscombe, in many ways, is in the background of Alasdair's thought here, and the return to virtue. Look at how MacIntyre uses that to develop his own vision. And then, since the whole idea of the Benedict option has received certain currency, something that Professor MacIntyre hates with a perfect hate, we can end with this Thomism, moral apprenticeship, and a new Saint Benedict. So that's our trajectory. So a disquieting suggestion. Next year will mark the 45th anniversary of the publication in 1981 of Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue, a study in moral theory. The lead up to this publication merits remembering. At midlife, MacIntyre found himself in the intellectual equivalent of Dante's dark forest. For like Dante's Wayfarer, for MacIntyre, quote, the straightforward pathway had been lost. MacIntyre describes the first 20 years of his academic pursuits from 1949 until his emigration to the States in 1971 as a period of heterogeneous, badly organized, sometimes fragmented, and often frustrating and messy inquiries, from which, he explains, he nevertheless learned a lot. Then there began, during his time first at Brandeis University and then at Boston University, years of, quote, painful self-critical reflection, during which he engaged in, quote, prolonged reflection on the inadequacies of his earlier work, unquote. The fruit of this self-critique was After Virtue. The book begins with what MacIntyre describes as a disquieting suggestion. Inspired by the work of by Walter Miller's post-apocalyptic science fiction novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz, MacIntyre invites the reader to, quote, imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe, unquote. The result of this catastrophe is that only fragments of scientific knowledge remain. MacIntyre invites us further to imagine that during a period of renewal, quote, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology. In this renewed but impoverished context, people argue about the merits of scientific theories while having little understanding of them. MacIntyre's point is that in this situation, quote, nobody, or at least nobody, realizes that what they are doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all, unquote. For although their activities have a certain consistency and coherence, quote, those contexts which would be needed to make sense of what they are doing have been lost, perhaps irretrievably. MacIntyre further observes, in such a culture, men would use expressions such as neutrino, mass, specific gravity, atomic weight, in systematic and often interrelated ways, which would resemble the ways in which such expressions had been used in earlier times. But many of the beliefs presupposed by the use of these expressions would have been lost, and there would appear to be an element of arbitrariness in their application. MacIntyre's disquieting suggestion is that an analogous catastrophe has already occurred in moral philosophy. Quote, the hypothesis which I wish to advance is that in the actual world in which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I have described, unquote. What remains are fragments assembled out of their original context. Quote, we possess indeed simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. MacIntyre was not merely offering a critique of academic philosophy. He discerned this incomprehension at every level of society, in our politics and in the remnants of our communities. A symptom of this incoherence, he asserted, is that our arguments over rights and obligations have become interminable. They are interminable because the protagonists in these debates, without knowing it, appeal to irreconcilably different understandings of obligation and of the good. MacIntyre famously traces the source of this incoherence in the failure of what he calls, quote, the Enlightenment project. MacIntyre explains that, quote, the thinkers of the Enlightenment set out to replace what they took to be discredited, traditional, and superstitious forms of morality by a kind of secular morality that would be entitled to secure the assent of any rational person. Some of the most powerful parts of his work is to trace this development, the desire to have saved the key insights of Christian morality, but ground them on a rationalism that from one way or another, whether it's Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, it no longer depends upon revealed religion. All right, so MacIntyre holds that, quote, the attempt failed, and what it bequeathed to us, quote, were a set of mutually antagonistic moral stances, each claiming to have achieved this kind of rational justification, but each also disputing this claim on the part of its rivals, unquote. As a consequence, our moral concepts appear to have a rational justification they do not, in fact, possess. The sensitive observer, MacIntyre argues, will discern that these groundless moral concepts in the hands of the powerful have become, quote, useful fictions that open us up to manipulation by the contemporary magisterial and therapeutic bureaucracies that govern us. MacIntyre readily acknowledges that he was not the first thinker to discern this. Almost 100 years earlier, during a rare period of physical health, Friedrich Nietzsche penned his last great work, The Twilight of the Idols, whose subtitle is, of course, famously, How to Philosophize with a Hammer. So, our number 2 on our list here, Nietzsche and Kamehameha II. Written in 10 days during the summer of 1888, while Nietzsche was on vacation in the beautiful Swiss lake resort of Sils Maria, The Twilight of the Idols expresses in condensed form ideas that had become the obsessive preoccupation of its author. Nietzsche articulates what he believes is the inauthenticity of European society. Interestingly, he sees this inauthenticity as especially present in the English-speaking world. Unlike the growing Gnosticism and even atheism of the nihilistic worldview beginning to circulate on the continent, an early expression of which is an early articulation of which is expressed in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, published in 1862. The denizens of the English-speaking world seemed to think that they could banish God but retain Christian morality. In this, they resembled the respectable German middle class against which Nietzsche was himself rebelling. Nietzsche describes them thus: they are rid of the Christian God and are now all the more convinced that they have to hold on to Christian morality. This is an English kind of consequential reasoning. The rest of us see things differently. If you abandon the Christian faith, at the same time, you are pulling the right to Christian morality out from under your feet. Nietzsche continues, this morality is very far from self-evident. This point needs highlighting time and again. If the English really do believe they know by themselves intuitively what is good and evil, if they therefore think they no longer need Christianity as a guarantee of morality, then this itself is merely the consequence of the dominance of Christian value judgments and an expression of the strength and depth of this dominance, with the result that the origin of English morality has been forgotten, and the highly qualified nature of its right to exist is no longer felt. For the English, morality is not yet a problem. For the English, morality is not yet a problem. How prophetic were these words? In 1888, the titans of the 20th century were already in their early childhoods: Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their lieutenants, while Hitler would be born the following year. By their actions and the actions of the societies that helped create them, and societies that they themselves helped create, confidence in the self-evidency of moral truth would be deeply shaken, even in the last bastions of this confidence in middle-class homes and institutions throughout the English-speaking world. In a sense, we are all the offspring of these shaken and troubled societies. Nietzsche foresaw what was coming. Because of this, MacIntyre portrays Nietzsche's role in Western culture as analogous to the one played by King Kamehameha II in Hawaiian and Polynesian culture. As MacIntyre explains, in a very elliptic account of Captain Cook's first encounter with the Polynesian notion of taboo, later on he will rectify this too elliptic account and give a fuller one in subsequent works. But in this elliptic account of Captain Cook's first encounter with the Polynesian notion of taboo, tapu or kapu, in 1777 at Tonga, the island of Tonga, when Cook and his sailors asked why certain actions were taboo, prohibited or restricted, the Polynesians themselves could not offer any intelligible reasons for these restrictions. They were thus found to be living by obligations, the sources of which were long ago forgotten. Not surprisingly, therefore, in Hawaii, Kamehameha was able to abolish taboo in 1819 with little resistance from his followers. It makes interesting reading. I recommend you read those accounts. This leads MacIntyre famously to conclude, why should we think about our modern uses of good, right, and obligatory in any different way from that in which we think about late 18th century Polynesian uses of taboo? And why should we not think of Nietzsche as the Kamehameha II of the European tradition? MacIntyre continues by explaining that it was Nietzsche's historic achievement to understand more clearly than any other philosopher not only that what purported to be appeals to objectivity were in fact expressions of subjective will, but also the nature of the problems that this posed for moral philosophy. Does this mean that objective morality is a fiction, and that those who appeal to the objective good are the contemporary equivalents of 18th century Polynesians, incoherently appealing to taboo? No, but it does call into question the rationalism of the Enlightenment, including those versions of Thomism that sought to portray Thomistic ethics as a form of enlightened rationalism, or even as a sufficient ethics. To understand the force of Nietzsche's critique, as well as the non-rationalistic account of the moral good that MacIntyre subsequently develops, it will be helpful to turn to another critic of the Enlightenment project, but one who focuses her laser-like intellect on a more specific target, academic moral philosophy. So point number 3, Elizabeth Anscombe and the return to virtue. When Elizabeth Anscombe wrote her groundbreaking essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, in 1958, academic moral philosophy in Britain was locked in debates concerning the character of moral goodness, debates pursued between deontologists and utilitarians. Was the moral good determined by one's adherence to universal and impersonal formal rules, such as Kant's categorical imperative, as the deontologist held, or was goodness instead a function of an act's utility, toward attaining satisfaction or contentment, as the utilitarians held. The question was thus whether rules or consequences had priority in moral analysis. This dynamic, as a parenthesis, this dynamic would later spread to Catholic moral theology in debates between groups that became known as revisionist or proportionalists and a group known as the new natural law theorists, all of which were arising when Paul VI put the question of contraception to a side, and throughout the 60s they were reflecting on would it be possible to separate the unitive and the procreative in marriage. And these two schools basically recreated the debates that had been going on in British moral philosophy. Another parenthesis, it should be remembered what led Miss Anscombe to write her essay in '58. Philippa Foot was going on a year's leave, going to Canada, and she needed someone to take over her classes. So Anscombe, who didn't normally teach ethics, accepted. Now, she was still feeling a bit bruised from her attempt to get her colleagues to react to Oxford's decision to give Harry Truman an honorary doctorate. She was already involved in the disarmament movement in Britain, and she felt that this was a scandalous thing to do, so she went around to her colleagues to try to get them to sign a petition against offering Harry Truman an honorary doctorate, because she felt that he was a mass murderer. So she was shocked that so few of her colleagues accepted. So it was out of this event that she then started reading to prepare for the class that she was taking over for Philippa Foot, all of the textbooks on ethics, and she discovered the same type of reasoning that led to the bombing of civilian populations, both in Europe and in Asia, was present in these and legitimized in these incoherent, as she saw them, introductions to ethics. So this so incensed her that she wrote this essay, famously Modern Moral Philosophy, that appeared in Philosophy, the journal, in 1958. So Anscombe responded that these divisions between deontologists and utilitarians are divisions of little importance, because both sides of the debate share the same unjustified and outmoded notion of moral obligation. Both sides affirm that the morally good act is one which we have an obligation to perform. From where, however, does this obligation come? Why am I obliged to maximize the satisfaction of the greatest number, or to act according to impersonal, universal rules? In essence, Anscombe was asking the meta question, why be moral? British philosophy, she argued, had no philosophical answer to this question. Instead, philosophers were continuing to employ a notion of obligation that was a vestige of their culture's religious heritage, a Christian, and I would say Lockean, notion of obligation based on divine law, as developed by the Anglican divines, who, like Locke, viewed the natural law as simply an expression of the divine will. This law conception of ethics gave terms such as ought or should a special moral sense, implying an absolute verdict that one is bound or is required to do the actions to which these terms refer. Anscombe noted that after the general abandonment of this Christian, I would say Protestant, conception of divine law, ethics finds itself in a curious situation. Quote, "It is as if the notion criminal were to remain when criminal law and criminal courts had been abolished and forgotten." In this context, that's the end of the quote, in this context, moral ought has become, quote, "a word of mere mesmeric force," unquote, employed without any rational explanation for its binding power in human action. Up to this point, Anscombe's argument is strikingly reminiscent of Nietzsche's, and I'm not the first to point this out. She too argues that ethicists employ moral notions that spring from a Christian conception of divine law, and that the ethicists themselves have rejected it. It is here, however, that Anscombe and Nietzsche diverge. For Nietzsche, those who have discovered the true genealogy of morality, that it is a fiction imposed on us by inherited patterns of oppression, must make a decisive decision, either to follow the submissive herd, and Nietzsche is very good at showing that there are certain, the slave mentality has certain consolations. So either follow the submissive herd or to become truly and heroically independent by creating their own values, to become their own lawgivers. As Nietzsche himself explains, quote, "With a creative hand they reach for the future, and all that is and has been becomes a means for them, an instrument, a hammer. Their knowing is a creating. Their creating is a legislation. Their will to truth is will to power." MacIntyre readily acknowledges that both Nietzsche's critique of the Enlightenment project and Nietzsche's call to embrace greatness by choosing our own moral values have a surprising plausibility about them, but only if the Enlightenment was correct in its rejection of the classical tradition of virtue. MacIntyre and Anscombe. If the Enlightenment had a false understanding of the classical tradition, then perhaps a path toward renewal becomes discernible, a path that Nietzsche failed to see. This is the path that Elizabeth Anscombe chooses. In modern moral philosophy, she argues that instead of wasting time in debates over the priority of rules or consequences, she's the one who introduces the notion of consequentialism, which her daughter argues that meant more or less rule utilitarianism. So priority of rules or consequences, moral philosophers need to develop a philosophical justification for moral obligation. What is needed, Anscombe affirmed, is, quote, "an adequate philosophy of psychology," which we subsequently learn is her term for a renewed Aristotelian analysis of human action, human flourishing, and the traits of character, virtues, that make this flourishing possible. Quote, "For the proof that an unjust man is a bad man would require a positive account of justice as a virtue. This part of the subject matter of ethics is, however, completely closed to us until we have an account of what type of characteristic a virtue is, a problem not of ethics, but of conceptual analysis, and how it relates to the actions in which it is instanced. It can be seen that philosophically there is a huge gap, at present unfulfillable, or unfillable, as far as we are concerned, which needs to be filled by an account of human nature, human action, the type of characteristic a virtue is, and above all, human flourishing." Anscombe went so far as to assert that we should stop doing moral philosophy until such a philosophical psychology is developed, because otherwise we will simply be writing nonsense. It is not an exaggeration to affirm that Alasdair MacIntyre has spent half his life attempting to supply the moral psychology, this moral psychology, but with this difference. MacIntyre believes that such a psychology must be centered in an adequate understanding of the history of moral inquiry and of its narrative character as lived within a tradition of inquiry. This will not merely provide us with a non-rationalistic account of moral truth. MacIntyre affirms that it will also help us understand moral error and moral disagreement, as well as some of the means toward overcoming them. So MacIntyre would often repeat in class that unless you have an adequate theory of error, of how the world can be as messed up as it is, your theory of the natural law is inadequate. So MacIntyre's solution, point 4, goods, practices, and the narrative unity of life and of tradition. MacIntyre responded to Anscombe's call to provide an adequate account of human flourishing by developing a theory of virtue that rejected what he then called Aristotle's metaphysical biology. MacIntyre, however, came to see that he was wrong, and this on 2 levels. First, although there is much in Aristotle's biology that is outmoded, MacIntyre came to see that any adequate account of human virtue must be based on some account of our animality. Human virtues are the virtues of a specific type of animal, and our theories of virtue must take this animality into account. Secondly, an adequate portrait of human flourishing must recognize that there are principles within us that are ordered toward this flourishing as toward their proper end. There is a dynamic givenness to nature that we are called to discover and respect. Indeed, MacIntyre will affirm that the incoherence of contemporary culture is largely the result of its rejection of this causality. As MacIntyre explains in the prologue to the third edition of After Virtue, his subsequent reading of Aquinas had led him to deepen his understanding of this aspect of human nature. Quote, "I had now learned from Aquinas that my attempt to provide an account of the human good purely in social terms, in terms of practices, traditions, and the narrative unity of human lives, was bound to be inadequate until I had provided it with a metaphysical grounding." MacIntyre was nevertheless still committed to offering a non-rationalistic account of how we come to know these metaphysical principles and to live according to them. Thus he adds, quote, "It is only because human beings have an end toward which they are directed by reason of their specific nature that practices, traditions, and the like are able to function as they do," unquote. What MacIntyre means here is that it is precisely because we are metaphysically ordered to human flourishing on the level of the principles of intellect and will that A, communities of virtue that promote this flourishing are possible, and that B, barbarous communities that are ignorant of true human nature, the true nature of human flourishing, can also arise. Or in other words, precisely because we are ordered to human flourishing only on the level of principles, we are able to apply these principles wrongly and to teach others to wrongly apply them. Thus, like Nietzsche, MacIntyre offers a genealogy of the Enlightenment's failure. Unlike Nietzsche, who only discerns a path for the solitary hero, MacIntyre sees that nature offers another path, a path for communities of virtue that, by promoting practices within a narrative of human fulfillment developed from within a tradition of inquiry, offer hope for an increasingly dark world. A full account of MacIntyre's understanding of virtue acquisition would require a detailed and lengthy study of MacIntyre's conception of practices and of the role that narrative and tradition play in promoting these practices. For our purposes, after offering a quick overview, I will suggest some of the implication of MacIntyre's insights for the future of Thomistic studies of the thought of Thomas Aquinas. MacIntyre defines the virtues in relation to what he calls practices. Examples of practices are the arts, sciences, games, as well as activities proper to communal, political, and family life. Virtues are dispositions by means of which we attain the goods internal to these practices. So someone who learns to play chess, there are many different ways in which you can learn to play chess, but if you have the true equivalent of a virtue of chess playing, you will begin to love, desire, and promote the goods internal to the game of chess. All right, so more than this, however, virtues dispose us to attain the integral good of a full human life, understood as the goal of a narrative quest. The very virtues by which we attain the goods internal to practices sustain us as we move toward human flourishing. Lastly, we undertake this quest as part of a tradition of inquiry and in cooperation with others. There is no solitary man of virtue because the learning of virtue is always in community. So the Cartesian ideal is a fiction. The virtues dispose us to seek integral human fulfillment as part of a narrative history that is larger than ourselves. Virtues thus dispose us to attain this integral human fulfillment in community with others in a way that promotes both their good and our own good, our common good. We can't attain the good internal to being a son or a daughter, a brother or a sister alone. That good is always a good that is experienced in common with others, those relational goods by nature, while maintaining and advancing the tradition of inquiry in which we were formed. This is the ideal. MacIntyre thus develops his understanding of virtue in relation to three notions: practices, narrative, and tradition. MacIntyre focuses our attention on these three concepts to show that the principles of practical reason, which the tradition identifies with the primary precepts of the natural law, and the goods toward which they direct us are not, quote, self-evident in either a Cartesian or a Lockean or a Kantian sense. Instead, we learn to act according to these principles and to pursue these goods by being initiated into the life and practices of a community. See the later Wittgenstein in the background here, as he is in Elizabeth Anscombe's Modern Moral Philosophy. This initiation has the character of an apprenticeship, whereby under the direction of mentors, who offer us standards of excellence to imitate, we learn in company with others how to live fulfilled lives within our communities. And the analogies are multiple. He gives the analogy of learning to play chess, but Servet-Pinckaers uses the analogy of learning a foreign language or learning to play a musical instrument. There's always a standard of excellence, trust in a mentor, initiated into the rules, the practices of that activity, and you do it in company of others, recitals with people who are the same musical ability as you, little vignettes where you learn to speak the language, you're with others learning how to order a coffee or order a meal. All of these ways in which we gradually learn the activity, and something analogous not just for learning a language or playing the piano, but living a life. This initiation occurs either well or poorly. Moreover, as noted above, bad practices and disordered loves can lead communities to become barbarously vicious. Instead of ordering their members toward integral human fulfillment, they tragically dispose their members to pursue false fulfillment and illusory goods. In the years following the publication of After Virtue, MacIntyre sought to identify more fully the ensemble of activities by which a community helps its members develop rightly ordered desires as a prerequisite to human flourishing. The task is daunting and the perils many. MacIntyre brilliantly reformulates his insights in his most recent book, and I hazard to predict his last, Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, an essay on desire, practical reasoning, and narrative. Attempting to appeal to the plain person's perspective. MacIntyre's idea of the capacities of a plain person are much higher than most of us. But anyway, plain person perspective. After leading the reader through his narrative account of the demise of the West's moral certainties, MacIntyre invites the reader, whom he imagines to be an average representative of contemporary culture, to take seriously the Nietzschean challenge as reformulated by MacIntyre. That once you understand the fictional character of your moral perspective, to be true to yourself, you must either embrace Nietzsche's call to become your own creator, or you must undertake a quest pursued in community with others to discover or rediscover the true way towards human flourishing. By means of this, MacIntyre leads us both to rediscover the amazing dynamism of human nature as well as the fragility of human culture. This twin truth has implications for the future of studies, of Thomistic studies. It is to this we now turn, so our concluding section. Thomism, moral apprenticeship, and the new St. Benedict. When MacIntyre considers Thomism as a tradition in three rival versions of moral inquiry, He faults 19th century Thomists for thinking that they share more principles in common with their secular interlocutors than they do. Specifically, they had a false confidence in a shared knowledge of the natural law. Aquinas, MacIntyre reminds us, was acutely aware, on the contrary, of how disordered desires can blind us to moral good, and that, as a consequence, the human person, unaided by grace, was unable, quote, to live by the natural law and to achieve the excellences of the virtues. Far from leading one to despair, however, Aquinas, MacIntyre argues, sees this recognition of our poverty as part of the process whereby we receive the grace of conversion and the theological virtues that conversion brings. Although the knowledge of God and the principles of the natural law were and can be discovered by non-Christians, this knowledge is strengthened by means of divine revelation of, among other things, the Decalogue. And we are empowered to live according to this knowledge by means of the life of grace. For MacIntyre, therefore, the Thomistic tradition of moral inquiry is lived from within an apprenticeship in Christ and through the guidance of his church. From this perspective, philosophy as we know it, and this is key for MacIntyre, although he doesn't always say it as explicitly as we might like him to, from this perspective, philosophy as we know it, as the systematic study of what we can know about the world from human reason alone, is itself the product of the Christian community, of the Catholic tradition of moral inquiry, and therefore depends on it for its very existence. Secondly, we can come back to that in the question and answers. Secondly, philosophy so conceived does not supply what contemporary philosophers would call a sufficient ethics. This is one of the reasons why MacIntyre always refuses to be called a virtue ethicist or a communitarian, because both those etiquette, both those titles presuppose that one believes that it's a sufficient ethics, that here we have the sufficient ethics, virtue ethics. He doesn't think it's possible. Just as Aristotle, who in the Nicomachean Ethics both identifies the essential characteristics of human happiness and recognizes that they are not fully attainable, that perfect happiness would be the life of a god, MacIntyre asserts that the philosophical quest ultimately leads to the discovery of philosophy's insufficiency. In this, MacIntyre resembles patristic thinkers such as Clement of Alexandria, who sees philosophy as a preparation for the gospel. MacIntyre further asserts that this was also Thomas Aquinas' view. More than this, Fra Tommaso de Aquino is himself, from this perspective, a model of how one must live in order to see the truths, the strengths and the limitations of both Augustine and of Aristotle and the thinkers of our own day, in order to bring them together in the service of truth. Specifically, Tommaso de Aquino lived a specific form of life that grounded the practices of daily communal life, meals, prayer and song, the liturgy and labor, in the study and celebration of the scriptures and the fathers of the church, as ordered to the proclamation of the gospel. MacIntyre's extended study of human desire confirmed him in his belief that in order to see, to perceive, and to embrace the virtues and goods constitutive of human flourishing, one has to live a certain kind of life, a life that disposes our emotions and our will to desire these goods and to live these virtues. In spite of the many forms of life that can dispose one to seek human fulfillment, these disparate forms share several features in common. They employ and order the ancient human activities. I mentioned this last night. The ancient human activities that we have increasingly excluded from our lives. Song, dance, meals, works of mercy, both corporal and spiritual, as well as collective forms of civic decision-making and reconciliation that promote community life. I remember I was back teaching in the United States at an undergraduate institution, And I asked, these were honor students in one of New England's original 13 colonies, whether any of them knew where their precinct, their local party precinct was, and had they ever participated in their hometown in any local election. Now, for my generation, this was bread and butter. We learned by going and putting flyers for our candidate on the windshield wiper, underneath the windshield wiper of our neighbors, going door to door, asking them to come to greet the local candidate at someone's home. Those practices of local democracy, how many of Generation X and Z do any of that? It seems that their political involvement is watching someone criticize on their phone the political institutions, but the actual lived experience of being part of civic decision-making. And what I'm tracing here is basically what Alexis de Tocqueville described as the habits of the heart that support, promote, sustain democratic institutions and certain ways of thinking about human flourishing. But more anciently, they're embedded in communal song, not listening to music that's recorded, but singing together, dance, meals, not just eating, but meals, and then the works, Pope Francis was very good about renewing this, the idea of the traditional corporal works of, and spiritual works of mercy. Visit the sick, bury the dead, and, visit those in prison, welcome the stranger, all of these. Moreover, the apprenticeship of the theological virtues and the life of grace is facilitated by one's exposure to the natural forms of apprenticeship in arts, crafts, athletics, as well as contact and interaction with the natural world, especially domesticated animal and plant life that is essential to the flourishing of human life. We become more and more alienated from traditional practices. Ideally, not only do such practices help us to love and live the goods integral to human flourishing, they dispose us to see our contemporaries with greater compassion. Instead of viewing those who reject our understanding of the moral good as wicked and irrational persons who are willfully rejecting self-evident moral principles, we can see them as hostages, victims of a bad moral formation, who deserve our compassion and respect. Moreover, instead of subjecting them to moral harangues about their wicked behavior, we can become models of a different way of living, a way of living whose beauty and goodness will proclaim their truth beyond what our words can ever articulate. In the contemporary context of the destruction of traditional institutions of higher learning, MacIntyre's theory of moral development suggests that students of Aquinas should spend more time creating practices that instantiate the truths that Thomas proclaims. For Thomism to have a future, a new generation will need to fall in love with and become emotionally connatural with the truths of the gospel and the God creator, the creator God whom the Gospels and St. Thomas proclaims. Experience suggests that the best way to instill this love is by means of a holistic program of physical, emotional, and social apprenticeship in the practices of human life, by means of song, dance, celebration, courtship, and craftsmanship, whereby we come to understand, love, and cherish these timeless truths of nature and of grace. Interestingly, a bracket for those who love literature, Shakespeare, whenever his characters seem to lose sight of who they are and what they should be, he sends them into the green of nature, the forest of Arden. So in As You Like It, the court jester comes up on Corin, the shepherd, and he says, I want to see whether there's any philosophy in him. And Corin says, well, I know that the principal cause of darkness is the absence of the sun. I know that water is wet. Now, it has comic effect, but it has something deeper. And many have perceived this. So when Orwell writes 1984 in his island retreat up in northern Scotland in 1948, he appeals to Corwin's insights. So what does he have Winston Smith say? Truisms are true. Hang on to that. Water is wet. Fire burns. Stones are hard. Okay, so sending people back to rediscover simple truths. These timeless truths of nature and grace. This is why MacIntyre concludes that instead of awaiting the arrival of Nietzsche's Übermensch, the heroic but solitary creator of his own values, what we await is a saint who will call us to new forms of evangelical community that embody the practices of liturgy, service, and evangelization. In other words, we await a new, quote, doubtless very different St. Benedict, unquote. Like the restless and dissatisfied Christians who followed Benedict's example, and you think about who were Benedict's contemporaries. Boethius is almost an exact contemporary of Benedict, but so is Justinian. Okay, so like the restless and dissatisfied Christians who followed Benedict's example, MacIntyre recognizes that we restless denizens of modernity also thirst for, quote, new forms of community within which the moral life can be sustained, so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. Besides helping future generations to love the good and the beautiful, it might also furnish the conditions for the birth and education of a new Thomas Aquinas, a Christian genius to help us rediscover the true, the good, and the beautiful. So, thank you.